one of the companies I worked with was a German company that was doing a lunar lander, and they spent a lot of time on developing a lot of money. They actually raised a significant amount of money, putting a lot of money into developing the specs for the lander, but not figuring out where the market was. For example, they didn't have a big presence in the United States. As you know, a lot of the funding for space, for better or worse, comes from the United States, from NASA. The CLIPS program for lunar missions, for example, is a major source. And it's pretty hard. It hasn't been proven that there's really private money to support this initial lunar economy yet. I haven't been convinced about that. I mean, there are private solutions that can support government missions there, which is what NASA is doing, and I think that makes a lot of sense. But things that make sense on a private sector basis, standalone, that where both the provider and the customer are private sector entities, it hasn't been proven yet. Hopefully that will happen. So I think I think that company ended up going bankrupt this summer. And it's back in the market now in a new kind of format. So, I think they've learned some things from that, but, it's hard to raise money, easy to burn through it. And I think you have to use it very strategically. And it didn't do, the problem I told you about, where I mentioned earlier about where they didn't really spend enough time figuring out where they were going to get the revenue from, and putting money chasing that, building capability to secure that was a problem.
Okay. Now, on the flip side of that, I do think that you believe it's an exciting time for startup companies in the commercial space sector. So how does that work?
I do. I think I think as you've seen launch costs driven down, you have been able to have lower cost vehicles being able to be launched that have have some risk in it, as you pointed out. And, there is risk, there is more failure. Osiris, I think the biggest difference between the missions today and, let's say, a NASA mission, osiris-rex, is just the margin of error you're willing to accept. If you have a $180 million launch for a vehicle to go to an asteroid, you just don't want the thing to fail, So, so you have a lot of redundancy, a lot of testing, and all that is very expensive. When you have a lower cost paradigm, I mean, you're able to take bigger risks. And I think that's pretty exciting what we're able to do. I mean, most of the money right now, I think, is really Earth-based observation. So that's it's collecting data from Earth in a cheaper way, whether it's tracking. One of the companies I worked with, tracking methane leaks, for example, making fertilizers applications more efficient. This was another company in CDL. There are these different markets that there were terrestrial-based applications, but they just weren't as effective because we didn't have as much data, and they weren't as ubiquitous on the planet. So that I think really creates some really exciting opportunities.
So is that where you're seeing investment going? I think
you've
got more to say than I believed at the begining on this.
Well, I think the biggest investment really is Earth-based observation. That's where I think there's a handful of profitable, or hopefully profitable, launch companies now. Then there's companies making the spacecraft, and there's a handful of those. Then there's companies that make those spacecraft operate more efficiently. There's some, propulsion systems that are pretty innovative coming out. There's some control systems that allow people to control the spacecraft better. Then there's the data that comes out of the spacecraft, and there's some companies that are making that access to data more efficient, like Skywatch. That's another company in CDL. That's a great company. And then there's a bunch of companies that are really using all those platforms to gather data that can be used by different commercial sectors on Earth. And I think that's where you're seeing the strongest economics right now, are those companies that are doing that. And whether it's a company tracking shipping, a company, like I said, methane gas, crops, where buildings are taking place. Obviously, there's civilian and there's military applications of these applications. So I feel like that's where the insurance sector, is another revenue source for this kind of business. So I'm seeing that's where the most customer money is going, and I think in some ways the most exciting startups are.
Okay, let me ask you to put your attorney hat on for the moment and ask you, do you see startups consistently missing something important about legally protecting themselves, or are they generally doing a good job of this?
No, they miss it all the time. I work with a lot of startups, which is an area I like working in because I have a business and legal background, so it helps. but it's hard because money's tight, so they do things themselves. They draft collaborative agreements themselves, which sometimes they go and they regret later. They haven't really thought through the risks of what they're doing, even NDAs. But especially collaborative agreements, and then fundraising. They might have not had that sophisticated counsel for early fundraising, and they end up giving more rights away, not just valuations, but rights away than they needed to. And IP protection, of course, is another area, which can be extremely complicated and expensive. So you really have to get the best bang for your buck, because you can spend huge amounts of money on IP protection. And where do you get the most value? And what do you really? What should you really do in that strategy? And then just corporate governance. How do you organize your boards? What kind of meetings do you have? Are you in compliance? And then export is another area that I work in, that which is a very complicated area from the United States perspective. Export compliance, and you don't want to make a mistake of it. There's been some companies that made mistakes and paid the price for it. And it can also, it's not just that gets you in trouble, it can actually interfere with your business model going down the road, because certain clients, like certain government clients, aren't going to work with you if you have that problem. So yeah, there's a lot of need, and usually low budgets, and it's usually one of the last things people think about.
More engineers are not going to solve your problem. It's not a technical problem in that sense. It's a process problem. And the time to fix your processes was 20 months ago, and the second best time is today. This is Jason Kanigan, the president of Cold Star Technologies and the host of this podcast, the Cold Star Project, which is all about identifying and solving process problems for space companies, because that's what we do. And you can hear the entirety of this episode by following the link in the comment below.